Strategic Bombing Part 1. The Geometry of Ruin. The briefing room at RAF Bomber Command's High Wycombe headquarters was a cathedral of cold calculation. The air, thick with cigarette smoke and the scent of weak tea, hummed with the low murmur of men whose job it was to translate policy into annihilation. Wing Commander Alistair Finch, a veteran of 30 missions over the Ruhr, sat with his crew, his face a mask of professional detachment. Before them, the intelligence officer, a man with the pallor of someone who never saw daylight, pointed with a long wooden ruler at a mosaic of reconnaissance photographs. The target was not a factory complex or a rail yard. It was a city. Hamburg. Operation Gomorrah. The objective, the officer intoned, his voice devoid of inflection, is to break the back of the U-boat industry and, crucially, shatter civilian morale. We are to create a firestorm. He tapped the map over the densely packed medieval street plan of the city's working-class districts, Barnbeck and Ham. The housing here is old, timber-framed, tinder-dry. Concentrated bombing will generate such intense heat that a self-sustaining meteorological phenomenon will occur. The fire will create its own wind, a hurricane of flame, sucking oxygen from shelters and consuming everything in its path. Finch listened, the clinical language coding a horror of biblical proportions. A firestorm. It was a term from the Luftwaffe's Blitz on London, now refined, industrialized, and returned with compound interest. This was no longer precision bombing, a fiction long abandoned in the European theater's perpetual overcast. This was area bombing, a doctrine championed by Air Chief Marshal Arthur Bomber Harris. If you cannot destroy the factory, you destroy the city that houses the worker, the home that shelters him, the will that sustains him. It was total war, stripped of chivalry, reduced to a grim equation of rubble and resolve. On the night of July 27, 1943, Finch's Lancaster Aries, heavy with a mixed load of high-explosive cookies to blow off roofs and thousands of incendiaries to ignite the innards, joined the stream. 799 other bombers droned alongside, a vast, dark migration of death. Over the North Sea, the routine set in, the nervy search for the Pathfinder's marker flares, the tense run through the initial flak blossoms over the coast, the stomach-churning corkscrew evasions when a knocked Jaeger's twin engines were spotted in the gloom. Then, Hamburg. The Pathfinders had done their work. The city was laid out beneath them not as a map, but as a living, bleeding wound. Great clusters of green and red marker flares floated down, painting the districts in an infernal glow. The first waves had already struck. As Ares approached its run, Finch looked down. He had seen bombed cities before. The angry red pinpricks of Cologne, the scattered fires of Berlin. This was different. This was a lake of fire. Individual blazes had already coalesced into a single roaring sea of orange and white. The smoke column rose to 20,000 feet, visible from 100 miles away, a boiling black pillar that seemed to hold up the sky. Bombardier Henry Hank O'Reilly, an American from Ohio on exchange, called out corrections in a steady voice. Left, left. Steady. Finch held the Lancaster perfectly level, a sitting duck for the flak that was now coming up in a solid, pounding wall. The aircraft shuddered. A shell burst close off the port wing, a flash of blinding yellow. Then came the call. Bombs gone. The Lancaster leapt upward, relieved of its terrible burden. As they turned for home, Finch banked slightly, a violation of protocol, to look back. The sight rooted him to his seat. The firestorm had been born. The colossal heat was sucking air into the city's heart with the force of a gale, creating a literal hurricane of fire. Flames shot hundreds of feet into the air, visible from the cockpit as rushing rivers of light. The superheated air above the city was rising so violently, it was generating its own thunderstorm, complete with lightning flashing within the smoke column. Hank O'Reilly, his professional calm shattered, whispered over the intercom. My God, it's like the gates of hell opened up. Below, in the cellars of Ham, the theoretical became human agony. The firestorm's winds, reaching 150 miles per hour, ripped oxygen from underground shelters, suffocating those who hadn't already been cooked by the heat radiating through the earth. Those who fled into the streets were swept into the flames by the tornado-like drafts or melted into the bubbling asphalt. The tar on the roads caught fire. The canals boiled. In a single night, Hamburg was transformed from a metropolis into a crematorium. Over 40,000 people, mostly women, children, and the elderly, were killed. The aim of breaking morale was, in its most literal sense, achieved. But the cost, etched in the pilot's mind not as statistics but as a vision of earthly damnation, posed a silent, screaming question. Had they just crossed a line from which there was no return? As Ares limped back to base, one engine feathered from flak damage. The crew was silent. The war had a new taste. And it was ash. Part 2. The Wind of the Gods. The war moved east, and the doctrine of area bombing found a new, even more horrifyingly efficient application. In the Pacific, Major General Curtis LeMay, a grim cigar-chomping tactician, faced a different problem. High-altitude precision bombing of Japanese industrial targets, often obscured by cloud and the jet stream, had failed. The Japanese war industry was dispersed among countless small workshops and homes in densely packed, flammable cities built of wood and paper. LeMay made a ruthless calculation. He would strip his B-29 superfortresses of their defensive guns and armor, load them with maximum incendiary clusters, napalm, and send them in at low altitude, at night. The target for the night of March 9th at 10, 1945. Tokyo. The aiming point, the working-class district of Shitamachi along the Sumida River. Captain John Jack Rawlings, piloting a B-29 named Dauntless Dottie, felt the strange lightness of the aircraft, unnerved by its vulnerability. Flying at 5,000 feet, they were within range of light flak. But LeMay's gamble was on shock, weight, and fire. As they approached the coast, the navigator murmured, "I can smell it already." It was the smell of a city of millions. Charcoal, fish, sewage, life. Then they saw it. The Pathfinders had marked the target with a flaming X. The first sticks of incendiaries were falling. What began as scattered fires, like matches struck in a dark room, became, in minutes, a conflagration that defied human understanding. The wind, a real wind, not just the firestorm's draft, a strong spring breeze that night fanned the flames into a racing front. It became the Kaze no Kami, the wind of the gods, a divine punishment made by man. Rawlings's bombardier toggled the release. 6 tons of M69 incendiary clusters spilled from the bay. Each cluster broke apart, scattering hundreds of napalm-filled tubes that stuck to whatever they hit and burned at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. From the cockpit, it looked like the city was being sown with deadly glowing seeds that instantly sprouted into giant raging flowers of fire. The thermal updrafts from the immense heat buffeted the 30-ton B-29 like a toy. The aircraft soared and plunged in the hellish turbulence. The sky was a copper dome, reflecting the inferno below. Ash and embers, some as large as hands, smacked against the plexiglass. Below was an apocalypse scripted by efficiency experts. The fire raced through the narrow lanes faster than a person could run. Families huddled in flimsy asbestos shelters were baked alive. The canals, intended as fire breaks, became boiling traps where thousands drowned or were scalded to death. The intense heat created vacuum winds that tore children from their parents' grips and hurled them into the inferno. The air itself became a poison, sucking the oxygen from lungs and replacing it with superheated gas and smoke. People simply burst into spontaneous flames as they ran. Flight engineer Mike O'Brien, staring down, saw a scene that would haunt him forever. A vast, black expanse where a city had been, pulsating with a deep, malevolent red glow, like a single, massive, living coal. The smoke was so thick it obscured the ground, but the light of the fire permeated everything, giving the cloud a blood-red interior. "It's like looking into a furnace," he said over the intercom, his voice hollow. "A furnace the size of Manhattan." When dawn broke, the wind of the gods had died down, leaving a silence broken only by the crackle of dying embers and the cries of the few survivors. 16 square miles of central Tokyo were utterly obliterated. The figures were numbing. An estimated 100,000 people killed, over 1 million left homeless in a single night. The firebombing campaign would go on, systematically burning Japan's cities to the ground, one after another. Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya. The moral calculus presented by LeMay was stark and brutal. This was saving American lives. Every factory worker's house burned, every dockyard district destroyed, was a step closer to avoiding the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands, projected to cost 1 million Allied casualties. The ends, it was argued in the quiet, map-lined rooms of the Pentagon, justified these terrible means. But for the men flying the missions, like Rawlings, the memory was not of strategic triumph, but of the smell of roasting flesh that permeated the cockpit even at 5,000 feet, a smell that clung to their uniforms and their dreams. They had not just bombed a target, they had become architects of hell, and the blueprints were drawn in the language of necessity. Part 3. The Twilight of Chivalry. By February 1945, the war in Europe was entering its final, brutal act. The Allied armies were at the Rhine. The Soviet juggernaut was steamrolling through East Prussia. The strategic rationale for the area bombing campaign was fading. German industry was crippled. Oil supplies were strangled. The will to fight, though fierce in pockets, was collapsing. Yet Bomber Command and the U.S. 8th Air Force had a machine, a vast, bureaucratic, and lethal machine that was built to destroy cities. It had its own momentum. The target selected was Dresden, the Florence on the Elbe. A Baroque jewel of art and culture, it was also a major transportation hub, a choke point for German reinforcements heading east to slow the Soviet advance. The Soviets had requested its bombing. The Western Allies agreed. For Air Marshal Harris, it was another cog in the machinery of his relentless campaign to prove that air power alone could crush a nation. For Flight Lieutenant Edward Clark, a Mosquito Pathfinder pilot, the briefing was laced with a peculiar unease. The war felt nearly over. The flak was less intense, the fighters rare. Yet here they were, planning an attack on a city swollen with refugees fleeing the Soviet advance, a city of little heavy industry, a city known for its china and its museums. The stated objective, the marshalling yards, lay on the city's outskirts. But the bombing plan, with its 2 massive RAF night raids followed by a USAAF daylight follow-up, clearly intended to smother the entire city center. On the night of February 13th, Clark's Mosquito, fast and nimble, darted ahead of the first wave of Lancasters. His job was to mark the aiming point with his characteristic precision. As he approached, the city lay glittering beneath him, largely untouched, its lights even visible. A rare sight in 1945 Germany. He felt a pang of something like remorse. It was too beautiful to burn. He pushed the feeling down, switched to his professional mind, and dropped his red marker flares directly over the stadium near the Altstadt, the Old Town. What followed was a masterpiece of destruction, a chillingly efficient execution of the firestorm template perfected at Hamburg. The first wave of bombers shattered the city's infrastructure and spread fires. The second wave, 2 hours later, found a city already ablaze, the fire services overwhelmed, and dropped its payload directly into the growing conflagration. The resulting firestorm was cataclysmic. The stone buildings of the Baroque city center, once thought to be fireproof, became ovens. The streets became rivers of flame. In the cellars where people sheltered, the temperature reached 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. The oxygen was sucked out, and people died without a mark on them. The fierce winds hurled people into the fire and lifted horses and carts into the air. Clark, circling high above in his Mosquito to assess the damage for the second wave, witnessed a sight of such awesome, terrible beauty it felt blasphemous. The entire city was a single, unified pool of liquid fire, a volcanic caldera of human creation. The heat generated a plume that rose 50,000 feet. He saw the shapes of larger buildings, the Frauenkirche, the palace swallowed by the glow, then vanishing as they collapsed. It was, he wrote in his log later, the nearest thing to a vision of the end of the world I ever wished to see. The aftermath was a new kind of propaganda defeat. German authorities, and soon after, neutral correspondents, reported a death toll in the hundreds of thousands. The true figure, still debated, lies between 25,000 and 40,000 FAS, still a staggering number for a single raid. The city, a cultural icon, had been erased. In Allied capitals, a quiet but profound unease took hold. Winston Churchill, who had once urged to set Europe ablaze, famously distanced himself in a memo, questioning the need to bomb remaining German cities simply for the sake of increasing terror. The phrase terror bombing entered the lexicon. The moral high ground, so carefully cultivated against the Nazis' own atrocities, seemed to be crumbling. For the airmen, the victory was Pyrrhic. They returned to bases filled with the rumor and the grim newspaper headlines. The war's purpose. The defeat of a genocidal regime remained just, but the methods now seemed to mirror the very totality of evil they were fighting. They had fought to preserve civilization, yet in its final act, their weapon had consumed one of its finest examples. The strategic bombing campaign had undoubtedly shortened the war and broken Nazi Germany's capacity to fight, but its legacy was a moral scar, a permanent question mark over the limits of necessity. Dresden marked the twilight of the bombers' war and the dawn of a lasting ethical ambiguity. It proved that modern technology, combined with total war ideology, could reduce the ancient, complex tapestry of human city life to simple physics: fuel, oxygen, and heat. The firestorm became the ultimate symbol of war's descent from a conflict between armies to a contest between populations, where the home front was the front line, and the distinction between soldier and civilian was erased in a storm of flame. The men who flew through those flames, like Finch, Rawlings, and Clark, carried home not just victory, but the heavy, silent knowledge of what that victory had required, and the haunting vision of a future where such calculations might be made again, with even more terrible tools at hand.